In the afternoon of December 2022, a high school biology teacher named Daniel Forrester drives to his residence with a bag of groceries. While on his way, Dan is on a phone conversation with a recruiter from the Army Research Laboratory. Dan reveals that he used to serve in the U.S. Army Special Forces, but he has found his passion in scientific research. He briefly holds the call and heads inside their house, where his family hosts a Christmas party and viewing of the World Cup, along with other local fans. Inside, Dan calls the attention of his then 9-year-old daughter, Muri, to help him with the groceries. He excitedly talks to his wife, Emmy, about his ongoing application at the research facility and informs her that he will catch up with them before the game ends. Dan resumes the call outside of their house, only to be told that he has failed to get the position. His mind goes blank for a moment, letting the news sink in as he attacks a nearby trash bin to let out his disappointment. He comes back inside their house and sits with his wife and daughter on the couch, watching the game together. As Muri snuggles against Dan, he subtly tells the two of them that his application failed. Muri keeps Dan's mind off his failed application by telling him about random scientific facts. They turn to the game, and Dan tells Muri that the soccer players on television are the best in the world. Muri expresses her admiration for her father, saying that Dan is the best at science and that she wants to become like him. She manages to cheer him up, and they, along with the other local fans, start to focus on the television. Just then, the television glitches for a few seconds, but later goes back to normal. The sudden interruption surprises the television viewers as well as the live audience. On the pitch, a large force field called the Time Portal emerges along with a few armed soldiers. Their arrival causes the audience on the pitch to panic, and they rush to exit the stadium. Meanwhile, Dan and the local viewers witness the events on the pitch. A female soldier, later known as Lieutenant Hart, taps onto the audio signals and calms down the audience. She introduces themselves as people from 2051 who are fighting a war. The female soldier announces that their enemy is not human, but aliens called white spikes. White spikes are pale alien predators with 4 main legs. They are fast and hostile, capable of shooting spikes toward their prey. Hart announces that they are losing, and as a result, it will ultimately wipe out all human beings in the future. She calls out to everyone in the audience for help, telling them that they are their last hope. A year after the shocking arrival of Hart and the soldiers, Dan watches the news from the television while a reporter gives an update on the war against the white spikes. It is known that the soldiers traveled from 2051 back to 2022 using a time travel device called the Jump Link. Immediately after their arrival in 2022, jump facilities were established around the globe to send the world's military into the future. The jump facilities are all connected and powered by the Jump Link, enabling humans to travel between the two timelines, 2022 and 2051. The first 1,000 soldiers were sent to the future war, but unfortunately, only a handful of troops survived. Civilians were eventually called to support the war effort, as only a few qualified soldiers remained. Hence, the world's leaders agreed on instituting a compulsory worldwide draft to send in the qualified civilians. On the other hand, tensions arise as anti-war movements call out the government and express their opposition to sending people on a war that has not even happened in the present. Dan falls asleep on a couch while watching the news, but he instantly wakes up at the sound of Muri crying in her room. He enters Muri's room and finds that she has woken up from a bad dream. He and Emmy soothe her until she feels better and succeeds at going back to sleep. The next day, Dan goes to work discussing a biology lesson to his high school students who were seemingly bored and uninterested. He notices this and decides to talk about something else with his students. Dan asks his students what gets them excited, and a student named Martin aggressively raises his hand. He and the class tiredly listen to Martin, who always likes to talk about ancient volcanoes during his classes. After Martin, students start to speak up, asking Dan about the purpose of everything, knowing that they will lose to the aliens anyway. Dan relieves them that the war is years away in the future and that they can still do something by innovating themselves through their improved knowledge of science. Later, Dan heads to their local office after being called to check his draft status. Military personnel run a test on him and he talks to them out of confusion. Dan asks the soldier for the supposed requirements, where he finds out that only those who have died before 2051 are allowed to travel to the future. Following that, he learns during his drafting process that he is to be pronounced dead in 2030, which allows him to participate in the war. He tries to process the information while they attach a jump band on his arm, a device that allows him to be tracked anywhere on Earth. They also tell Dan that he will be imprisoned if he attempts to evade the draft or tamper with the jump band. The military personnel give him 24 hours to settle his personal affairs before he proceeds to their basic training. Meanwhile, Emmy, who is a licensed therapist, gathers the returning draftees for a treatment. The returning draftees, all injured and amputated, suffer from so much post-trauma and they can barely talk. In the middle of the session, Dan enters the room and Emmy notices the jump band on his arm. The two talk after the treatment as Emmy anxiously urges Dan that they should run from the government, but he tells her that it is impossible to do given the 24-hour grace period. Through the insistent remarks of Emmy, Dan ends up meeting his estranged father, a mechanical engineer named James Daniel Forrester Sr. Dan shows James his jump band, asking for his help to remove the device. However, it instantly leads to an argument as the two bring up their unresolved issues regarding their broken family. Dan prohibits James from meeting Murray and he insists on having no contact with him. His argument with his father has left him with no other options but to finish the mission. Because of this, Dan comes back home telling Emmy that he has decided to join the war instead. While Emmy cries in worry, Dan relieves her that he only needs to stay for 7 days and that he will survive. Outside their home, he approaches Murray and tells her that he will be leaving for a trip. Murray stares at him and understands that he got drafted, trying to fight her tears. Shortly after, he bids Emmy and Murray goodbye before leaving for the basic training. Inside the training facility, the Minister of Defense delivers a speech for the civilian soldiers from 2022, referring to them as heroes who have fought not just for their country, but for humanity. The soldiers from 2051 who previously arrived are responsible for training the civilians how to use their weapons. They tell them to aim for the white spikes' throats and abdomens in order to kill them. Qualified civilian doctors are also called to teach them how to do first aid. During Lieutenant Hart's orientation to the civilian soldiers, Dan meets Charlie, a fellow draftee with a PhD in Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. Charlie's chattiness irritates Dorian, a survivor during the first deployment who is currently on his 3rd tour, as he stops Charlie from talking. In the midst of their break time, Dan and Charlie talk about their theories on time travel. They suppose that the time travel process does not allow a meeting between a past and future self, so those who are dead by 2051 are sent to the future, while those who are not yet born in 2022 are sent to train the civilians. The civilian soldiers are also divided into 2 forces, the D-Force and the R-Force. They are also taught that every 6 days, the white spikes crawl back to their nests, which they call the Sabbath. Dan, Charlie, and the civilians who are knowledgeable on science are assigned to the R-Force, wherein they will assist the researchers in 2051. Later that day, the civilian soldiers are forced to be deployed earlier because the last remaining research facility in 2051 is under attack. They fall in line as one after another their bodies get sucked into the jump link. The civilian soldiers are set to drop on Miami Beach. However, the jump link malfunctions and drops them hundreds of feet in the air down to burned buildings. Most of the civilian soldiers fall hard on concrete, leading to their deaths. Dan falls in a pool area on the roof of a building, along with Charlie, Dorian, and a small group of soldiers. They observe the city from the rooftop and discover how the city of Miami is completely destroyed, with all its buildings burnt and abandoned. Shortly after, a colonel from a military control center contacts the civilian soldiers on the roof. She informs the soldiers that the white spikes can no longer be stopped in the city. The entire city will be bombed and every living thing in the area will be eradicated. As a result, she assigns the civilian soldiers to rescue a stranded research team in a laboratory nearby. Dan leads their small group of civilians as they proceed with their rescue mission. Upon reaching the laboratory, they find the research team all dead, so the colonel instead instructs them to retrieve a set of hard drives along with several other research materials. Meanwhile, an extraction team prepares to fire the bombs on the city as the colonel rushes Dan and his team to move out of the laboratory. At this time, white spikes are slowly approaching the laboratory, preventing them from going to the main exit. The colonel provides them with a new exit, and they all head toward the stairwell after retrieving the important research materials. Sensing a possible threat, the civilian soldiers quietly walk down the stairs. Inside, they encounter living white spikes for the first time, and the group shoots at them together. The white spikes attack them in an instant, killing a few soldiers while the rest runs down the stairs. As they near the exit, a white spike catches up on Dan, but Dorian arrives and kills the creature. The civilian soldiers leave the laboratory while numerous white spikes are closing in on them. At the same time, the military personnel drive around the city in high multi-purpose wheeled vehicles to fetch Dan and his team. The colonel instructs the civilian soldiers to avoid the areas with red smoke because it will be bombed. However, they get cornered by the white spikes and are forced to run toward the red smoke. Just when Dan and his group are about to meet with the military personnel, a group of white spikes attack the vehicles, killing the soldiers on them. The civilian soldiers run away from the red smoke while shooting at the white spikes, barely reaching the safe ground while an extraction team bombs the area. Later, Dan wakes up in a medical tent along with Charlie and their small group of soldiers. He and Charlie walk outside, seeing a military base full of troops. They find Dorian in a corner where he reveals that he has cancer with 6 months left to live. Afterwards, 2 soldiers arrive to get Dan as requested by the colonel, while Dorian and Charlie get redeployed. Dan approaches the colonel and she thanks him for recovering the hard drives and the important research materials. Just then, a soldier approaches the colonel, referring to her as Colonel Forrester. Dan salutes to her and observes their similar surnames. Soon, Dan realizes that Colonel Forrester is his daughter, Murray, in the future. Dan becomes speechless and emotional after seeing his daughter Murray as an adult. He walks toward her for a hug, but Murray keeps her distance and instead invites Dan for a walk. While she catches up with him on her career and educational background, Dan listens to her admiringly. Inside the control room, Murray shows Dan a sample of a female white spike, which is more aggressive and rare than the males that they previously encountered. Dan learns that the key to winning against the white spikes is to discover a toxin that can kill both the males and females. Murray assigns Dan and the extraction team to acquire a female white spike that they can use for their study. Afterwards, they board a helicopter on their way to the white spike's nest. Inside, Dan tells Murray that he knows about his impending death, asking her what happened before he died, but she evades his question. Their team arrives at the location as soldiers sedate the female white spike inside a cave. They pull out the female creature from her nest, but she continues to resist, killing the soldiers inside. Murray instructs Dan to stay in the helicopter before she rappels down into the cave. She shoots the female white spike's tentacle while the rest of the soldiers pull the creature into the cage. Soon later, the male white spikes run toward the nest to protect the female. Dan catches sight of them, making him leave the helicopter to kill the approaching males. He enters the cave and sees the female white spike attacking Murray. He grabs hold of the female's tentacles to free Murray, and the two of them push her toward the cage. The helicopter successfully acquires the female white spike, while Dan and Murray ride an armored vehicle to escape from the males. The vehicle settles on the beachside while they wait for a helicopter to pick them up. Dan questions Murray why she keeps her distance from him, and she finally reveals that in the near future, Dan abandons Emmy and Murray. He refuses to believe that he would do so, saying that he would never leave his family. She continues in tears, telling Dan that he was killed during a car accident after his divorce with Emmy. After their conversation, Murray walks away from Dan and heads to the approaching helicopter. The helicopters, along with the female White Spike, head to Deep Swell 9, a secured base surrounded by an ocean where the jump link equipment is also located. The researchers sedate and chain the female White Spike inside a laboratory while they study her. Muri takes several samples of enzymes from the female White Spike as she and Dan run thousands of tests on its genetic composition. Late into the night, Muri dismisses Dan and lets him rest while she continues to work. Muri proceeds with the tests until morning when Dan offers to take over. Instead, Muri instructs him to bring the working toxin back with him once they succeed in finding one. The working toxin should be mass-produced in his time to be able to kill the White Spikes before the war even begins. Soon later, one of the tests detects a working toxin labeled as R7 in the same time that the female White Spike recovers from sedation. The female White Spike screeches at the laboratory while breaking through her chains. Making matters worse, a large number of male White Spikes are approaching the Deep Swell 9 to rescue the female White Spike. The males breach the perimeter, and in defense, the soldiers shoot them away using the choppers. During this time, a week has passed since Dan arrived in 2051 and has 8 minutes left before his tour of duty ends. The military personnel's new mission is to protect Dan and the jump link for him to make it back in his time with the working toxin. Muri and Dan rush outside the laboratory toward the choppers. Meanwhile, the female White Spike is released by the males from her chains as she actively looks for Muri. The female White Spike calls the attention of the males as they surround the location of Muri and Dan. The two shoot side by side against the surrounding creatures, skillfully killing them. As they run near the choppers, the female creature shoots a spike at Muri's abdomen, wounding her. She holds onto Dan while escaping from the White Spikes. They watch as the choppers crash one by one from the attacks of the White Spikes, burning a large area of the Deep Swell 9. Shortly after, Muri is badly wounded and is unable to move further. She tells Dan to leave her and move along, but Dan stays with her, and the two of them sit on a corner facing the ocean. Muri apologizes to Dan for keeping her distance during his stay and tells him that she is happy that they got to reunite amidst their situation. The two reconcile and she gives him the working toxin. Just then, the female White Spike locates them, about to attack Muri. The creature slips off the corner railing but drags Muri down with her. Dan manages to catch her, but her hand slips, causing her to fall into the ocean with the rest of the White Spikes. While he tries to jump down to reach her, the jump link activates and he is brought back to his time along with a few other survivors. In the present time, Lieutenant Hart and the soldiers rush to give them medical aid. As soon as Dan wakes up, he instructs Hart to mass produce the vial and send it to the future. However, Hart informs him that because of the attack in Deep Swell 9, the jump link went offline and time traveling can no longer be done. She and the rest of the soldiers who came are permanently stuck in 2022. Later, the survivors of the war reunite with their relatives. Emmy welcomes Dan back with a hug, and he stares at her while still disoriented. They return to their home, where he finds young Muri welcoming him with a poster. He becomes relieved after seeing her alive, embracing her tightly. That night, Emmy wakes up from her sleep and catches Dan staring at Muri while she sleeps. Dan tells Emmy about his experience during the war and how he interacted with their adult daughter in the future. They agreed on solving the problem with the White Spikes together, beginning to speculate how the creatures got into the Earth. The next day, he meets with Dorian, Charlie, and his student Martin to look into the possible location of the White Spikes. They discover that a ship containing the White Spikes has been in Russia for a long time, but only emerged after the snow around their ship melted in 2048 due to global warming. In an instant, they ask the defense minister for help in funding their mission in Russia, but he declines. Aside from their lack of evidence, the defense minister states that the mission is not a priority. The world is currently in a chaotic state since the advocates of anti-war are actively rioting everywhere. Dan ultimately meets with his father James to seek his help in their mission, and he agrees. Afterwards, Dan gathers Dorian, Charlie, James, and Hart. Hart arrives with a few containers of the mass-produced toxin R7, and they all board James's plane going to Russia. The team reaches the glaciers in Russia, and they look for any signs of heat or magnet below the thick layers of snow using their geothermal devices. After a while, they stop at a spot where their devices malfunction. They set up a bomb around the spot and successfully find the alien ship. Inside, Dan and the team discover the very first batch of white spikes inside their pods, ready to breed. One by one, they inject the produced toxin on the white spikes, which kills them. However, a few white spikes escape from their pods. The team splits up as Dan leaves the ship to join James and Charlie, while Dorian and Hart hold off the remaining white spikes inside the ship. Hart discovers a whole colony of white spikes deep inside the ship, on the verge of escaping, so she and Dorian blow the entire ship with them using a C4 bomb. Meanwhile, Dan, James, and Charlie chase down the last remaining white spike, which happens to be the pregnant female. Dan and James reconcile during their mission, and they move to locate the female white spike while Charlie stays behind to keep watch. After much struggle, Dan and James successfully kill the pregnant white spike by forcing the toxin in her mouth before pushing her down the snowy cliff. Eventually, Dan reunites with Emmy and Muri after their mission in Russia, while he brings along his father James to finally introduce him as part of their family. The Tomorrow War intended to present a time travel narrative that anyone can easily follow. However, its execution is lacking in order and detail. There are parts in the film that may seem minor, but because there are no answers provided, it leaves the viewers to question the logic and depth of the plot. Nonetheless, the film may pique the interest of particular viewers, such as the time travel and sci-fi drama enthusiasts.